Okay, we are back. I want to remind listeners we're visiting with the esteemed journalist Pedro Lawrence, and this is 91.7 KOOP right here in Austin, Texas. This is Bringing Light into Darkness. So let me ask you, Patrick, we have Mueller that'll be testifying here in just a couple of days. We've made the judgment that there has not been evidence to support the major claims that have been put forth by Mueller. More important to me is what keeps on getting repeated by presidential candidates and such that keep on suggesting that instead of asking the right questions and seeking the evidence, they'll make remarks like, well, are you going to believe Russia's denials or our own intelligence agencies? And especially for someone, certainly myself, that's studied for so long, so many misleading and absolute erroneous walks to war based on faulty intelligence, you'd think by now we would demand that evidence. But what would you, in your mind, what are the major, if you can enumerate, 2 or 3 or 4 of the most important elements that you think would be worthy of asking Mueller that either points out contradictions in his report or helps to flesh out the truth of the matter so Americans can get kind of all sides of the issue?
Right. I think the very most essential one, the bedrock question in this whole Russiagate fabrication, your readers might as well know that's what I think it is. The very most key issue is the 2016 mail leaks, right? They are alleged to be hacks by Russians, okay? It's been demonstrated with forensic evidence. This is what I wrote about in The Nation in August of 2017. It's been demonstrated with forensic evidence, persuasive forensic evidence of numerous layers, I would add at this point, that it was a leak. The technicalities of the download, the speed of the download was not possible over the internet at that time. The metadata on the files, the way the files were enumerated in a system called FAT, which the pattern of the enumeration only applies to memory keys, thumb drives, other portable devices, right? This sort of stuff, admittedly, it's very techy, a bit hard to follow, but a good journalist can unpack it well enough for the general reader. It's all there, right? This is the most central question. Now, Mueller, first thing, this is an exquisite example of how this narrative has sort of self-prolonged, if you will, okay? Mueller never really investigated, he never investigated the events of the mail theft, pilfer, whatever you want to call it, right, in 2016. He relied on the presentations of CrowdStrike, a private firm hired by the Democratic Party, plainly a other than disinterested party, right? And they didn't do any due diligence either. The FBI didn't do any due diligence either. So what I'm saying is the absence of evidence reproduces over and over again, such that Mueller can write in his report that it's an assumption that the mail theft was a hack, when behind it, he hasn't done any of the work. I will point out some other things to your listeners.
Before you move on, though, just to highlight what you're saying here, for those that are not familiar with CrowdStrike, what Mr. Lawrence is alluding to is the fact that instead of the FBI under James Comey taking ownership of the actual server to examine forensically for himself, it's almost like the weapon of a crime scene, so to speak, to follow these clues. In fact, it was the DNC that inspected its own server, hiring a private entity.
CrowdStrike is a very severely compromised company. That's a matter of record. Mm-hmm. And you get some really funny business. This is when you must conclude there was some kind of across-the-board conclusion. The crime was committed. The DNC refused, the FBI requested, so far as we can make out, in the most limp-wristed sort of way, the FBI claims to have requested the servers. The DNC said no, and the FBI said, all right. Since when is that the way a proper investigation by a federal agency is conducted. Ridiculous right there. So you have to say there was some measure. It's very opaque. Let us not make the mistakes of those we're speaking against. There was some measure of cooperation between the DNC, acquiescence, whatever you wish to call it, between the DNC and the FBI, right? Then the FBI took a report from James Comey took a report from CrowdStrike. As I mentioned a moment ago, your listeners can look this up. It's in my columns, among many other places. A severely compromised organization, okay? Not to mention the fact, once again, that it was hired by the Democratic Party, the DNC, I beg your
Well, speak to the severely compromised, because I know it is, but I think our listeners need to know examples of that compromise, if you can just speak to that.
I forget his title, CEO, co-founder, Alperovich,
right.
is vigorously anti-Russian. Shortly before the DNC incident, CrowdStrike had to retract a report alleging Russian interference in some Ukrainian hack situation, right? Alperovich is associated with the Atlantic Council, a dedicated think tank, anti-Russian think tank. It's the main theme of it, right? So there are problems with CrowdStrike, but the problems multiply out from there. Comey acquiesced when he wasn't given the servers, and what happened next? Well, Comey accepted reports from CrowdStrike as to what happened. It transpires, your listeners must forgive me, but it gets a bit dense here, right? Yeah. It transpires by way of the trial of Roger Stone just recently, when Stone's attorneys asked the prosecutors for copies of the CrowdStrike reports, the CrowdStrike's final report on what happened with the mail. And the Justice Department had to come back and say, we don't have a final report. All we have are a couple of redacted drafts.
Mm-hmm. Redacted by the DNC and CrowdStrike.
Redacted by CrowdStrike, indeed. Right. Now, this is why I go back to I'll go back to my thesis about design tolerances. This kind of shoddy, clamped together procedure, just shocking. It's unbelievable to me that this sort of thing is taken seriously. This is what I mean about irrationality. No one with a rational mind could possibly look at this situation and suggest that it's legitimate. It was all thrown together on the assumption that it would all evaporate come November 8th, right? So now it is just recently revealed that the Justice Department never even saw a final report from CrowdStrike. It probably never wrote one. It wrote a few drafts and redacted them and gave them to the FBI. This is what we're talking about. And when we come back to Mueller's referencing on the presumption of Russian culpability in a supposed mail hack. It's a reference back to this period. It's a reference back to what happened in 2016. The shoddiness reproduces itself, and I would like to see Mueller held up for this on Wednesday.
Right. Well, in the analysis that you just gave of CrowdStrike, which was very powerful, because apparently they had to retract a claim that Russian software was used to hack a Ukrainian military hardware, as you've indicated.
Was that what it was?
It was, and it was an error. It was relevant because they accused the GRU of using the same software. That was one thing. Also, to your point, there was also a CrowdStrike. If I remember, I've got a note jotted down that the CrowdStrike executive, Sean Henry, and this has been reported in a couple of places, Aaron Mate in his recent piece as well, but he led the forensics team, this guy Sean Henry, the CrowdStrike executive that ultimately blamed Russia for the DNC breach, but he previously served as an assistant director at the FBI under Mueller. So it's kind of a crazy coincidence, and again, when you add it all up, I guess that's what you're getting back to your point.
I think we need to dolly out here, Pedro, and say, rather than get your listeners lost in the thickets, right? what actually is going on here is the gradual revelation of the way in which the Democratic Party apparatus, the intelligence community, sections of the law enforcement apparatus, and of course the media, it's gradually being revealed the extent to which Russiagate is really misnamed. It really should be called Intelgate or something like that, right? I don't hold any great candle for Donald Trump, but this has been prolonged as long as it has, basically to discredit the president, right? And I hope your listeners will sort of follow the bouncing ball when Mueller gets up there.
Right? And I think also, the problem in this polarized environment, in the shallowness of the discourse, is that by critiquing the Mueller report, that does not mean you're pro-Trump and you think he's a good president or anything of that sort. The idea is just due process. If we lose our compass, then we lose our way. And if we lose our way, then we leave nothing for the next generation.
The Mueller report, as soon as it came out, became a sort of political Rorschach test. You could make it mean whatever you wanted it to mean. That should be obvious by now, right? What I'm hoping for, I'm not expecting a very great deal from Mueller. We're already being warned in the papers that he's a rather tight-lipped fellow and gives one-word answers. This is code for don't expect too much, right? But what I'm looking at is the Barr investigation. And Attorney General Barr is another person I don't hold any great candle for, okay? Very true. But he has it within his power to go down to the bottom of the swamp here, right? The question is, how far does he want to go and how far will he be able to go, right? There could be some very serious fights with the CIA, right, which guards its privilege. I think I read in the Times the other day, one of the CIA's great assets is to determine Barr is going to compromise one of the CIA's great assets, which is its right to determine what secrets it can divulge and which ones are hidden. Excuse me? Really?
Yeah.
This is so? I mean, I'm not talking about some overseas operation where people can be compromised. In this case, this is a CIA privilege. I really do beg your pardon, right? So we have to see where Barr is going. That's where my eye is now, right? And he is empowered to get to the bottom of it. It's all there. I want to stress for your listeners once again, all the evidence is there. People like Ray McGovern and VIPS continue to work hard. The forensic people associated with them continue to work hard. They're always issuing reports, and if you can follow them, they're very interesting and revelatory, right? But we have the evidence. It's a question of getting the evidence surfaced and accepted. And this is where you run into the problem of rational society, right?
Yeah, it does seem like there has not been a due diligence, at least from my perspective, by the Mueller team based on who they have
let me say something.
Who they have not called.
Mueller had an opportunity to interview Julian Assange.
That's where I was going. The people that he has not called forth is a good indication.
Why hasn't he interviewed Bill Binney, former technical director of the NSA? He knows this stuff the way you know the back of your hand, right? Why didn't he interview VIPS after VIPS 50? No curiosity whatsoever about the forensics. These are not make-believe forensics. They're for real. Well, no curiosity whatsoever.
Let's talk more about these actors and what they have said that raises such red flags that just don't get the kind of media coverage that the American people have access to. And we want to bring light to that darkness right after this next break. If you can hang on with us, Mr. Lawrence, we would appreciate it. We need to take one more break here. You are listening to the premier community radio station of the nation. That is 91.7 KOOP, Hornsby, Austin. Back after this.